Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We have people logging in from all across the globe. Thank you so much for joining this session hosted by Bero. Over 1,000 people have registered for today's webinar, and I am eager to see how many of you join us today. My name is Shakti Prasad. I am the head of content at Bero, and I run the Procurement Espresso magazine. I welcome you all to the webinar titled China Plus One, Challenges and Opportunities. This is a topic that's gaining momentum as companies globally seek to diversify supply chains and mitigate risks. We're going to be talking about how the changing world with its trade tensions and increasing costs is affecting businesses. We will be looking at some of the real world issues companies face when they try to move their operations, say from China, say to other countries such as India, Vietnam, Thailand, or Mexico for that matter. Additionally, we will be scrutinizing or looking into these options of cost structure associated with reshoring and nearshoring. And we'll also be discussing how to identify reliable suppliers in +1 countries and delve into how to find capable alternate suppliers in these regions. Before I introduce our speakers, just a few housekeeping rules to be kept in mind. All the participants will be on listen-only mode for the entire duration of the webinar. We'll be taking up the questions at the end of the presentation, but we would encourage our attendees to key in their questions or comments for that matter anytime during this session, and I will read them out for you. Please type your question or your comment in the control panel. You can see the control panel. Please type out any question or any comment or any observation that you would like to make. I encourage you to participate. There could be a lag of few seconds in between the transition of slides, so please bear with us. If you have any difficulty in joining the webinar, say for example, if the video is not fine or if my audio is spotty, please try to log back in or key in your queries in the Q&A box, and my team will try to help you. Now, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Robert Hanfield, a renowned professor of supply chain management at North Carolina State University, the NCSU. Hope you all can see him on your screens. Recognized as an authoritative voice in supply chain, Dr. Hanfield is regularly featured in prominent media outlets such as Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, New York Times, to name a few. And to those residing in the US, you may recognize him from his appearances on CNBC and Bloomberg Television. He is a prolific author on supply chain topics and is a reservoir of knowledge in this domain. In fact, my regular interactions with him have been highly illuminating, leading to publication of informative articles, informative pieces in Procurement Espresso magazine. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Velkumar Krishnan. Hope you all can see him on your screens. Vel is the esteemed head of Bero's digital program. So any content that you see on the live.ai platform, thanks to Vel. He and his team ensured that all the numbers and data and everything is updated, and he's also training our AI engine so that it becomes better in answering client queries. So Vel is a wellspring of category knowledge, and he has developed over the years extensive expertise in diverse facets of procurement intelligence over the years. He, along with his team, as I said, curates content for our platform. There is a reason why I invited Vel as well as Dr. Hanfield to this webinar, because if Dr. Hanfield offers say a macro perspective on the trends, Vel offers granular insights into micro trends, analyzing the feasibility of reshoring or nearshoring at a part level. So the macro and the micro, and let's see what they have in store for us. Thank you so much for joining the session today, Professor Hanfield and Vel.
It's my pleasure. Really, really pleased to be here on this webinar with you today, along with Bell and yourself.
Thank you. Next slide, please. We'll get started. So, Professor, I'll start with you. What are the practical challenges, Professor, companies face when shifting or diversifying a part of their operations from China to another country. You know, China is big, it's a production powerhouse, and it is always not easy. But then companies are thinking of China plus one because of diversifying risk diversification from a strategy, and also to ensure to escape some of the trade tariffs that US had imposed a couple of years ago. So what are these challenges and how do they vary based on industry from your experience? Your thoughts, Professor?
Yes, well, I think there's been a lot of anti-China sentiment recently, especially as a function of, the zero COVID policies, which shut down a lot of manufacturing and really disrupted a lot of supply chains. And a lot of industries have started to ask, well, should we be sourcing somewhere else? Is there somewhere else we should be going? Of course, China is still very appealing, and I don't think we will, move away from China. There's no doubt that China still offers the lowest, what we call FOB cost. If you just look at, the cost of products manufactured in China, the FOB price is still very competitive. They still have very good quality, very good execution. For certain industries like electronics, they're certainly very competitive still. And it's also important to recognize that in many industries, China has really become the preeminent manufacturer. I was recently speaking to an auto parts distributor, and he shared one story with me. He said there's only 3 manufacturers that produce 80 to 90% of the world's brake pads. And these 3 are all located in the same province in China. For us to start sourcing brake pads from anywhere else at a competitive cost, I mean, these organizations have moved down the learning curve. They've perfected their manufacturing technologies. They perfected their quality. They're extremely efficient. So just switching from one country to another is not that easy in many industries. And I spoke with another CPO from a large tool manufacturer, and his CEO came in and says, we're going to move everything out of China. We want to move it domestically or to Mexico. And he said, are you crazy? I mean, we would lose all of our market share if we did that. Our costs would double, and we would go out of business. So, there's some very practical implications here. It's not so easy as people say, just moving things from one country, from China to another country.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Professor, for that insight. Well, you've been to China, you've interacted with the suppliers, over the years, because of your study in market intel, that region. So what are your observations?
Sure, absolutely, Shakti. So how many hours do you have for that question?
3 minutes.
Okay, I'll keep this very brief, Shakti, and thanks for giving me the very unenviable task of having to follow Dr. Hanfield's footsteps in answering this question. I'm going to try my best to make sure I don't repeat anything which he said. So Shakti, the way I look at this is that there are 2 dimensions, right? So one is, what's the current lay of the land and its contours, right? What does that look like from a nearshoring or a friendshoring perspective? And also, what history has taught us and what the future looks like, right? So I'm going to pivot my answer across these 2 dimensions, right? See, I think based on my conversations with all of Bero's clients, Shakti, probably a few hundred of them in the past few weeks, I think the mega trends and the motivations for nearshoring are essentially regulations, geopolitical issues, supply chain diversification. You've got rising costs, you've got price and tariffs, you've got trade wars between 2 blocks, you've got the zero COVID policy, which the doctor just alluded to, and then you've got economic incentives in certain geographies. And then very importantly, freight time and costs and lead times, which sometimes could take up to 45 days if I'm doing a only China policy, right? So one of the things which I noticed, Shakti, is that when I looked at all of the trendsetters in this industry, electronics, apparel, footwear, automobiles, it's very important not to confuse any industry shifts to category shifts. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So when you look at nearshoring as a concept, Shakti, it is an org decision, right? It's an organization decision. It's probably a CEO decision. But then when you look at it through the lens of procurement, it becomes super interesting, because when you look at it, it actually becomes a double nested loop, kind of a double whammy on procurement, almost like a Christopher Nolan movie. There's procurement going into a matrix for two reasons, Shakti. One is, as the industry which procurement represents goes near shore, their supply base changes, right? So that's one impact. But then when you look at all other industries outside of one's own industry, as they keep nearshoring, and if that industry is a spend category into procurement, that supply base also changes, right? So it's very critical for procurement to be able to track what nearshoring entails, both from a tier 2 and a tier 3 supplier perspective, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Moving on. Next. Yeah. So, talking about infrastructure, Professor. China's infrastructure is famed. It's known for its giant infrastructure, right? So when it comes to potential +1 countries, say India, Vietnam, Thailand, or Mexico, comparing to China, so are there any standout nations that you think that are making significant strides in this area?
Well, I think, with China, I visited China in 2020. I'm sorry, in 2000, not 2020, 2000. And the infrastructure then was not so good. I remember going to Shanghai, and there was the modern part of Shanghai, Puzhong, but the other part was not so modern. And when you went out into the country, the roads were not that good. There wasn't really the transportation capabilities. It was starting to be built. And over the last 23 years, China has invested, billions, if not trillions of dollars in infrastructure, and has built, highways, rail, ports, and not only within China, but they have also invested heavily in other parts of the world, like Africa, for instance, in building ports and so forth. And of course, they have preference to use those ports when they choose.
Yes.
The other countries, I think, are really lagging. India's logistics infrastructure is not great, unfortunately. It really, but I believe that Modi is moving to really make some heavy investments in improving the logistics infrastructure. I know when companies like Walmart and so forth tried to work in India, they struggled with logistics. They struggled to get things from one point to another. Even the rail lines had different gauges, and it was all kinds of things that had challenges. Vietnam is also, along the port cities, logistics is pretty good. Same with Thailand. Mexico, most of the cities along the border have pretty good logistics capabilities, but when you get into some of the other provinces, it's less so. Okay. Mexico is also building, so Mexico is also improving, investing in roads. The nice thing about Mexico is most of the cities where there is a fairly large manufacturing base, places like Saltillo, Pueblo, Juarez, they've invested in roads, especially to be able to transport a lot of automotive parts right now. Automotive parts is a big issue at the moment. And I've been down to Saltillo. It's a huge manufacturing sites down there, and the roads are very good. And the automotive companies helped sort of contributed to that infrastructure to make sure that they could get trucks up and down the highway, to plants in the U.S. So that's been very good, and it's improving quite rapidly in Mexico, especially after the free trade agreement.
Okay.
I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah. Sorry, you have anything to add?
No, not at the moment.
Okay, cool. Whale, your observations on this? Infrastructure,
Yeah, so,
logistical capabilities in potential plus one countries?
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me talk about which countries are benefiting, Shakti. I clearly see 4 belts, right, or 4 clusters, if you can call it that. So let's start from left to right. So let's say you've got the Latin American cluster, Mexico for automobiles, aerospace, pharma, medical devices, e-commerce. I'm jumping to the diametric opposite end to Southeast Asia. You got Vietnam for electronics, apparels, renewable energy infrastructure, toys, action figures. And when you look at Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand for consumer electronics, electric vehicles, renewable energy, solar panels, so on and so forth. And then coming midway, you got the Indian subcontinent, right? India for automobiles, ancillaries, electronics, mobile phones, Bangladesh for textiles. And then you got the 4th belt or the 4th cluster, which is Eastern Europe, predominantly Poland for automobile parts, Slovakia for electric vehicles. So that's what I've seen. But the important observation here, Shakti, is that 1 in 4 conversations I'm having with Bero's clients are considering adopting a friendshoring strategy. I'm probably using the word friendshoring for the first time in this conversation. And almost everyone is rethinking their supply chains and trying to delink or hold off their China-only strategy, right? So I'm seeing trillions of dollars worth of spend moving to friendlier destinations, right? So China used to be the world's manufacturing plant. I truly believe, and I agree with Dr. Hanfield, that they will continue to do so. But then there is a shift in trend, right? All the way from offshoring in the 80s, where probably China was at the forefront because of IBM, has now transformed itself to friendshoring, right? And very interesting point, Shakti, is that, and I think this is, it's fantastic, that this includes China themselves, who are basically also heading nearshoring strategies, right? So if you know what I mean, China itself is basically nearshoring to Mexico, Vietnam, India, right? So Chinese companies are basically moving their production centers, their factories, their hubs, their R&D centers to markets. So when China themselves is actually adopting a nearshoring strategy, you know that things are going to change, right? So those are my observations.
Yeah, okay, that's great. It's a very, very interesting insight that you brought in, Vail. China themselves are, of course, absolutely. Next slide, please. Yeah, so influence. Professor, you're talking to a lot of industry leaders. So how is this China plus one strategy influencing reshoring decisions? Especially for companies based in, say, Western Hemisphere, the US, because let it be nearshoring or reshoring, it's a very American-centric concept, right? Because from the 80s, America shifted its manufacturing to China, and both these countries had a very symbiotic relationship. In fact, it's a bit strange that the buyer, in fact, the seller was giving, buying the buyer's debt, so that the buyer continues to buy from the seller. So that was the kind of symbiotic relationship both China and US had. So considering this, how is it influencing, this reshoring decisions? And our businesses finding it viable, say, to bring manufacturing closer to home? So it can be either Mexico or even to the US. So what are your observations?
Well, as I indicated earlier, China still offers the lowest FOB, right? It's still the lowest upfront FOB price. However, what manufacturers have come to realize, especially during and after COVID, is that there are a lot of invisible costs that eat away at your margins once you're sourcing from China. The first is a lack of agility and flexibility. Very often you have to place orders months in advance. In particular, we did a study in the apparel sector, and customer tastes are always shifting in consumer apparel. So if you have to make a forecast and order something months ahead of time, very often, you're going to get it wrong. So there's lack of flexibility to shift and to change and to pivot. There's also volatility in shipping costs during disruptions. We saw in 2021 and 22 a lot of problems at the LA port. Today we're seeing real problems with the Panama Canal. Panama Canal has hundreds of ships waiting to go outside. and it's likely to continue until 2024. So there's that's raising the lead times and the costs of shipping through the Panama Canal. The supplier is far from the customer, so they're in a different time zone, so it's difficult to communicate with them. Very often there's English is not a language that's well known. Very often, some of these suppliers are not quick to innovate, so they're very good at doing one thing over and over again, high volumes, but they may not be able to shift and pivot and innovate. It's difficult to understand what's the right level of inventory when you have a 20-week lead time or a 6-month lead time of stuff that's on a container ship and is coming over. It's difficult to pivot to changing customer demand, to customer preferences. From a sustainability perspective, moving things in a container across the ocean is not very sustainable. It's not good for the environment. And then there are also risks, as we saw, zero COVID and others as well, that interrupt what's happening. China right now, the geopolitical situation is very challenging at the moment. The real estate market is in free fall. So there's a lot of risks going on there as well in terms of sourcing. So these invisible costs are ones that have to be at least considered when you're making that China plus one decision.
Yeah, you raised very important points. That's current trends, you're right. There are some challenging economic numbers coming out of China. Yeah, of course, that is a topic for discussion another day. Vail, your observations on when it comes to influence of China plus one strategy on reshoring or nearshoring?
Absolutely. So let me bring a category lens to it. I think it's time I brought those guns in. So Shakti, let me talk about what is currently happening on the ground, right? Number one, let's say you look at specialty chemicals. It's moving to India from China, right? So when you look at fragrances, flavors, raw materials, so this will affect anybody in the personal product, CPG, food, beverage, and tobacco industry, right? So seeing a clear shift over there, right? Similarly, what you call as KSM, so key starting materials, which go into your APIs and excipients, which affects the pharmaceutical life sciences industry, seeing a shift from China to India, right? Pharma, luxury products, consumer goods are considering moving their raw material basis to Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, India, LATAM, away from China, right? When you look at bulk chemicals, right, your ethylenes and your propylenes and your derivatives of the world, very interesting point, Shakti, over here, is that it's very equally balanced, right? So when you look at upstream commodities, right, it's basically very well balanced throughout the globe, right? And I look at suppliers, supply, difficulty, so on and so forth, or the ease rather. But then as you go downstream, it becomes more difficult to find suppliers. Let me give you a good example, Shakti. So let's say you're looking at mining chemicals, right? I'm sure we've got folks from the mining industry in this webinar, right? Or metals, still controlled by China, right? Rare earths, 80% of supply of gadolinium, gallium, germanium is pretty much China, and then the rest is Africa, which becomes proxy to China, be it DRC or Sierra Leone, right? So you might have exit barriers being imposed. The only way you can actually take care of mooting this threat is by recycling of e-waste or deep sea mining, which should never happen from an ethical standpoint of marine ecology, so on and so forth.
Correct.
So
Correct.
Long story short, clearly seeing a dependence for Europe and US indirectly, because it gets exported from China into Mexico, Canada, US, so on and so forth. For some of the larger commodities, carbon steel, right, as an example, aluminum as another example, will be controlled by China. Some of your, like I said, specialty chemicals and your luxury products and all of that, you could probably start sourcing it from other nations, right? So those are my observations, Shakti. And to Professor's point on transportation logistics, one of the key difficulties I've seen is that you can have all the production capacity in different countries outside of China, but then if your Suezmaxes and your Panamax or your Panamax, for example, somebody is transporting 2.1 million bushels of soybean as part of their food products. If that cannot enter a port, there is absolutely no point in nearshoring to a nation which does not have those kinds of capabilities, or you're going to have a repeat of what we saw, where somebody tried to make a U-turn on the Suez Canal and then got stuck for months, right? So that you need to make sure that practical challenges are addressed in your China Plus One strategy.
Okay, that's very, I mean, really deep insights in terms of categories, Whale. So moving on, next slide, please. Yeah, so advantages of nearshoring. I think, Professor, you had mentioned this in the when you answered the previous question, in terms of lead times, cultural similarities, and of course, time zone alignment. Are there any specific countries or regions? Of course, we spoke about Mexico, Thailand, India repeatedly, but then when it comes to industries that are ripe for China Plus One, which country do you think is in a better position to take advantage of?
Well, you know, I think one of the big benefits of nearshoring is you know, I mentioned flexibility, agility, and lead time, especially when you're talking about you know, heavy commodities or heavy industries. Many of the ones that Bell mentioned, having it closer is simply better. But there's also you know, a number of other benefits, and for this example, I always point to Japanese auto companies, specifically Honda and Toyota. And previously at Michigan State, I spent a lot of time studying Honda and visited them in Japan and in Ohio at their Marysville facility there. And Honda has always adopted a sourcing strategy that is we buy where we sell and we sell where we buy. And the idea behind that is to have suppliers close by to your manufacturing sites, to your assembly sites. And they do that for a number of reasons. Number one, it facilitates just-in-time or lean manufacturing. They can do multiple deliveries per day to that site. JIT got a very bad name during COVID, but that's because people thought JIT meant you carry less inventory. That's true, but it also means that you have local suppliers that you can work with that are much more flexible, that are much more responsive. And if there's a problem, you know, you have this engineers on site. They can meet with engineers from the other company. They can work through the issues, whether it's a quality issue or a technical issue or an efficiency issue. And you have that multi-level collaboration that's occurring between finance, IT, engineering, quality assurance, sourcing, et cetera. And you also build those relationships to drive innovation. And having all those people together will certainly drive more innovation and more cost efficiency as well. Yes, you know, again, the per unit price, the labor costs are higher, but the benefits of doing so are much greater. We've also seen, I'll continue, I have some other examples, but I want to turn it to Vel now as well.
Well, do you have any observations on this, or should I go back to?
No. I've got a couple of really quick observations on this, Shakti. So let me quickly take off from where Dr. left. So let me segue into what FDIs are showing, Shakti. So one of the interesting parameters which we track is what's FDI looking like, right? And very plain and simple, Shakti. When you look at China's global share of greenfield FDIs since, let's say, the mid 2000s.
Sorry, FDI, you mean foreign direct investment? Foreign direct investment.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely, Shakti. I should have clarified that. Thanks for catching that. Right, rapid deceleration over the last 19-20 years. Direct observation, right? What used to be 25% became 11%. I think it's down to 4% or something like that, right? But this does not mean that China is not going to be optimal location. It will continue to be for certain commodities. I think the key over here, Shakti, is to understand what categories make sense to nearshore, what categories don't make sense, which industries make sense to take the nearshoring route, which don't, right? So companies have started to diversify the investments to look at other countries to source the same product, right? Like you rightly said, it's a China Plus One strategy. right? Short-term, China will continue to be a high supply partner, right? So let me give you a very simple example, which I saw last week. So let's say you look at Poland, right? And then China has onshored not just the finished product capacity, but also the deep value chains attached to them, right? So trying to replicate this outside of China or trying to find out an alternate supply source will become time-consuming, expensive, and will be hampered by a lack of alternatives, right? So if you look at EV batteries, right, and you look at Poland's export, right? So Poland is showing the fastest growth, but then end of the day, when you look at the raw material, which is artificial graphite, it comes back to China, right? So they will continue to grow over there, right? So it's about understanding which are your tier 1, tier 2 categories. It's about understanding which regions make sense to nearshore, which doesn't, and then having a category strategy very specific to the products which are critical for you. That's the way I would look at this, Shakti.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think China is like world leaders when it comes to major industries such as electronics, automotive parts, machinery, pharmaceuticals. I mean, they have like end-to-end supply chain players and the entire supplier ecosystem operating out of the country. And then suddenly shifting, say, one part to some other place can be challenging. Professor, would you like to add? Do you have any additional observations on this?
Yeah, I think one of the things that well, you can move to the next slide if you like. That's fine.
Okay.
I was going to continue along those lines of what are the right costs, and I think I mentioned previously that there were different costs associated with managing these risks, these geopolitical risks, transportation risks, and then government restrictions. Certainly, we saw during COVID, and we came up. We recently did a project with an apparel company. We looked at 4 factors that were really important to quantify, and these are elements that are not well quantified in most industries, in most companies. And the first is demand volatility. How much confidence do you have that that demand volatility will put you at risk? And then seasonality, inventory turns, the season, how long the season will be, how long the lead time will be. So having offshore sourcing will increase that cost of demand volatility. The second cost is what I call the cost of being wrong. And very often, we so many industries, particularly in consumer goods, they try to predict what the customer is going to want. And what if the customer wants something else? Then you have a lot of inventory that has to be sold at a discount, or even in some cases sent to landfill, or it expires if it's in the pharmaceutical industry or food, for instance. So the cost of being wrong can lead to a lot of discounts, and can also lead to cannibalization of your own product if others jump in and try to take it. The third piece is inventory carrying cost. It's today, inventory costs are at least 18 to 25%. If you think about the cost of dead stock, which is leftover stock at the end of the season or stock that can't be used, what is the cost of that? And then of course the other cost is just understanding those risks. What will happen if there's a disruption? What happens if a factory shuts down? What happens if there's an ethical sourcing issue that comes up that puts you out of that harms your brand? What's the cost to your brand? So understanding all of these types of costs is important, and quantifying them is even more important, because most companies do not quantify them and don't do a good job of trying to assess, how much of their margin is eaten up by these other costs.
That's great. So moving on, Bill, do you have any observations to make on this?
Yeah, I'm good, Sati. I'm keeping an eye on time too. I think we should move on.
Okay, cool. Next slide, please. Yeah. So, Professor, what are the best practices and tools for identifying, say, reliable suppliers in this potential +1 countries. So are there any specific platforms and networks that you think have proven effective?
Well, I think you need to have people who speak the same language, who understand the culture, and who are good at evaluating factories in places like Thailand and India and Indonesia and India. You can't go in there alone and expect to understand everything that's going on. So really having someone who has deep expertise in that industry, who's maybe done supplier audits before, who is willing to go in and conduct an audit of a supplier's facility and understand what's really happening. Before you put your trust in any new supply base, you have to validate, the capabilities. You have to understand the relationship. You have to understand the financial capabilities. So there's a lot of variables that are covered. And we cover that in our textbook. We also covered it in our new book, Flow, How the Best Supply Chains Thrive. So it is important to look at all those parameters and really have a deep knowledge of that supplier before you write a contract with them and start doing business.
That's great. Yeah. Sorry. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think so. How best to assess capabilities, capacities, say technological advancements in this new region, Professor? And especially what benchmarks or standards should procurement professionals use of comparison?
Well, I think, in terms of evaluating capacities and standards, there's a number, we're doing some work on something called the Ethical Apparel Index. And, there's a number of really good third-party audits and assessments out there, companies like WRAP, WRAP, SEDEX, SA8000, and others. But then also, I think it's important to have some of your own engineers, whether it's supplier engineers, cost engineers, visiting that facility and, with a translator and understanding exactly, what their capabilities are. Also, I think the other thing is, if you're looking for a new supplier, have they ever done business with an American firm or a firm in a Western country? If they haven't, you maybe need to engage a broker to help them because it can be very complicated. Transportation issues are very complicated to manage whenever you have shipments from another country. Currency issues is another thing that has to be worked out. Currency is extremely complicated. And, are you going to hedge or are they going to hedge or how are you going to work through those elements? So having a professional, either a consultant, a broker, a third party on board is really the best way to ensure that you're doing a thorough job of evaluating those capabilities. And then also having an engineer walk their floor and understand what are their technological capabilities. Is their equipment up to date? Are they using the most modern technologies? Is it very manual labor based? And if so, is that a risk? There's a lot to it in terms of assessing these capabilities.
That's great. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, we have spoken the trends and the current latest situation in many countries. But then when it comes to procurement, so what? It's always like how do you discover and vet new suppliers in +1 region? For example, if their company gives them a mandate to look for new suppliers in alternate region, they will have to do so. So Rob, do you have any thoughts before I move to Vail on this?
Well, just one comment. I think, for large OEM firms, in apparel like Nike and Adidas and others, they already have, these systems for doing their own vetting and auditing and so forth. For smaller brands, it's much more difficult to do that because you don't have the resources to spend all that upfront investment in discovering how well they're doing. So again, I urge people to use third parties. we're actually working on building a digital platform in our ethical apparel index to look at how to do that. And we're targeting smaller brands as well, because we feel that there's a gap there for them to really be able to trust a specific platform or network. Companies like Barreau, I don't know if Barreau offers something in this space, and I'll turn to Vel here.
Yeah, that's great. That's correct. So, Vel, some practical elements to showcase for our audience today, how to find suppliers, say, in alternate +1 regions. I mean, do you have anything
let's do that.
Okay.
Yeah, so let's fire it up on the screen. So, Mishran, if you can actually do that. So, Shakti, what I've got for you is a mock-up. Okay. So let's say I'm looking for nearshoring agro commodities, right? I choose the HS code, I choose the commodity, I choose the category I'm buying, I've got a description of the category, I put in the destination country and I put the country of origin, right? So I'm currently buying from China, but I want to understand what I can do outside of China, right? So it works on the simple logic of trade data, customs data, reorders which are happening between different nations, who are the top exporters by value, by volume, who are the other countries outside of China. It also removes countries who are reliant on China. If somebody is buying it from China and then exporting it, how do you take them away from that equation so that it's pure supply-driven geographies? What's the impact of ocean freight? Like Doctor said, very critical. That's a price escalation. What's the deviation from what you're currently paying versus any other alternate locations? Brazil, as Vietnam as an example, right? What's going to be the tariff charges, right, Shakti? You got anti-dumping, you got most favored nation status, you've got your landed costs which need to be taken into account. You might have an embargo between two nations, right? You might have a UFLPA flag, which is your Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, right? How do you make sure it's compliant to your Norwegian acts and your LKSGs, which is your German supply chain acts? How do you take them all together and then basically show which countries make sense? And then you can do a deep dive on that country. I think it's important to understand what the price forecast is going to look like, right? So it's not just about current costs. What's it going to look like 18 months from today? Who are the top suppliers, right? And the interesting part over here, Shakti, is you can actually determine who's selling to who and who's buying from who, right? Because it's really critical, because you have a rough idea of who's already tested the market, right? So one way of doing it is like what Dr. Hanfield said. You put in your cost engineers, you put in your auditors, you put in your entire workforce to do that. Or you can quickly learn from what did my competitor do? What did my peer in some other industry do? They're buying the same category. What volumes are they buying? What's the bill of lading data? Which ports are they buying from? And more importantly, which suppliers are they buying from, right? So you could do all of that, and you could pull out all of this data. So it's quite straightforward. I think the point over here, Shakti, is that procurement should not play the job of a trade analyst. Procurement needs to be making strategic decisions. Like Doctor said, how do you basically assemble all the data feeds so that you can actually make the decisions yourself? It's as simple as that. And in line with today's times, you can also build an AI layer on top of it, Shakti. So for example, you can query all of this data using very, very simple AI technologies. So what is being shown on the screen is basically a ChatGPT enabled version of Barreau data. So I can go in and ask a question saying, hey, tell me who the top exporters into the US other than China for this particular commodity over the last 5 years, and tell me what's the tariff impact, tell me what's the logistics impact, right? So you can do that at any point of time. And you don't need to be figuring out these answers yourselves is the point. So as it keeps circling, I'm waiting for the AI engine to kick in so that it actually tells you what the trends in the marketplace are. And in a few seconds, it should be able to tell you based on everything which we just discussed. Here are the top suppliers, here are the top buyers, right? You can see it populate on your screen. And then it tells you this is what Philippines is doing, this is what Thailand is doing, this is what Vietnam is doing, like whatever you need, right? So just to summarize, Shakti, data sets all the way from compliance, PEP, adverse events, supply chain disruptions, trade data, bill of material based data, marry them all together, build the logic, and then let AI do the rest to help you with the decision making. Just help, not to make the decisions though. So it's quite simple and powerful that way.
That's great. So it covers, like, I'm assuming, almost all the commodities that are supposed to be covered. And
yeah, anything which took the air route, the rail route, the road route, and the sea route will be covered. So essentially your indirects or your services might not be covered, but anything which can be physically seen will be covered.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for that practical application, Vail. I think we have received a lot of questions. So let's move on to Q&A. I think this question is from Erica. I think it's kind of related to the tool that you showed, Vail. Can you also use this tool based on CAS numbers for specialty chemicals in pharma?
Yeah, short answer, Erica, is yes. So you could use your CAS numbers. So the way it works is very simple. We'll pull out the equivalent HS code from the material masters, and then we'll be able to match it. So you can use your CAS numbers. You can use, I don't know, a SIC code or a NAICS code or a UNSPSC code. It would translate it into the right taxonomy and pull the data. So answer is yes, you could use your CAS numbers.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Ray. So next question is from Kim Franson. I think perhaps, Professor, you can take this one. When companies have been working in convenience with Chinese suppliers or services for decades, how good are companies, in your experience, to build a mature or a sufficient organizational structure, harmonizing skills and strategy to match the nearshoring direction? I think it's a question of, if you had worked with a Chinese supplier for decades, is it replicable in other regions?
I think the short answer to that is it depends. I think having deep experience in one region or country is certainly beneficial as you're moving to others. But again, there's really big cultural differences. I don't think you can compare, for instance, China, Vietnam, and India. Those are three completely different cultures, and that means different norms, different ways of working, different ways that people learn, different ways that organizational governance is managed. So it's really important to have someone with a local presence that understands those cultural norms, and because ultimately supply chains are about building relationships, and you have to start the relationship out on the right foot, and you have to be able to adopt to other ways of working, the way other suppliers in other regions work. And so I think that's important to have that local knowledge if you're going to go in and start working with suppliers in these regions.
Okay. Next question is from Anne Edginton. It's actually a very interesting question if you look at it. What is the best way to confirm that a supplier is sourcing their raw material outside of China also? So I think it looks into tier 2 and tier 3.
Yeah, I mean that is definitely challenging. I don't know if that maybe some of Bureau's analytics are able to look at that, but I know understanding tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers is very difficult. The best way is to go in and talk to their procurement people, look at their POs, look at the source of those inputs, go to their receiving dock and see where the stuff is coming from. That's the best physical evidence there is. Sometimes if you rely on a supplier to share that information, they may or may not be transparent. They may want to disguise things, to avoid difficulties. And I've seen that a lot in overseas in different countries. Vel, I don't know if you've seen the same thing, because you've been to a lot of different factories as well.
Well, you have any observations, or should I move on to the next question?
No, I would agree with Dr. Hanfield. So absolutely aligned on that, Shakti. I think we should move to the next question. I've not seen anything different. It's spot on.
I think this question you can take it up, Vail, because it's related to the demo that you have done. It's from Emily Bame. What's the difference between your AI tool and tools like Panjiva? I'm not sure if you heard of that.
Yeah. So Panjiva is basically S&P's product, Shakti. So it's Standard and Poor. So they acquired Panjiva a couple of years ago. So they've got a fantastic product, no doubt about it. So the difference, Emily, would be is Panjiva would be generating data purely based on trade data. Like I mentioned, from your world customs database, it would not have any market intelligence around alternate suppliers. Alternate suppliers based on capacity, innovations, like Doctor was talking about, what kind of technology do they have, what their ESG scores are there any supply chain disruptions around working with a different supplier or a different geography? Are they susceptible to, for example, a cyber attack? What's the financial risk of working with that supplier, short-term, long-term, right? So think of Panjiva plus all of your supply chain, financial, adverse media, ESG scores, all of that. And top of that, what's your category risk, right? Tier 1, tier 2, what's the value chain? What are the dependencies? So the tool which I was showing you will give you that enhanced output of everything, including a price projection, which is what we call as inflation or budgeting. So the use case fits into not just nearshoring, it fits into your budgeting strategy. So that's what the difference is. The data could come from Panjiva, right?
Okay.
Additional.
Sorry, I lost you there, Vail. I'm not sure if it's my connection. Anyway, okay. Next question. It's from Anne. When you say China plus one strategy, does this mean long-term China is still the main supplier? That is supplier base, and if yes, what should be the percentage? Would you like to?
Yeah, I can comment on that.
Yeah.
You know, and again, I'm using an example just from a single study that we did, and I think what we're seeing is, you know, there's if you weight these different risks and different costs, you know, again, the supply chain cost of supply chain risk, cost of demand volatility, cost of being wrong, cost of inventory. You know, China is still a viable strategy. Companies will use what they call low and slow. You know, for those categories that are low and slow, low cost and slow movement, you know, of goods is okay. Fairly stable demand, fairly stable lead times, fairly stable prices. I think China is important to continue to support those kinds of categories. But for those that are fast moving, for those that have you know, high demand volatility, high supply chain risks, I think maybe a blended strategy of maybe 80% China, 20% domestic or nearshore is a good mix, because the nice thing about having a domestic or nearshore supplier is they can adapt more quickly. They may be higher cost, but they can shift and they can meet requirements that perhaps you know, a Chinese supplier would not be able to meet. A good example is, you know, all of a sudden, what if, you know, the blue shirt suddenly demand shifts to green shirts, you know, and everybody wants a green shirt. So, you know, a domestic or nearshore supplier can shift and make that change. Whereas if you've invested in China and you have a 6-month lead time and you've purchased, you know, 2 million shirts that are blue, it's difficult to change them all to green overnight.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I think related question to this. Oh yeah, sorry. So go on with, yeah.
Yeah, so Shakti, I was just pulling up the benchmarks while Doctor was answering, and it's very, very, very close to what Doctor was saying. So so to Anne's question, so let's say 100% of a category supply, somebody is sourcing it from China. The goals which an organization usually sets, and I'm taking a mean average, Shakti, so think of it as a benchmark, is to do 85-15. So Doctor said 80-20, right? So 85-15 is the first step which I've seen. 85 with China, 15 with another nearshoring market. So that's considered a good start, right? So I would say 85% is a standard benchmark which we've seen out there.
Okay, and percentage cost increase for a +1 supplier? Do we have any
It
benchmarks?
could be a decrease. It could be a decrease too, Shakti. I think it again depends upon what category you're talking about. Agro commodities, you'll see a sizable decrease, right? So
Yeah.
edible oils, sorbitol, so you're going to see a sizable reduction. I think it depends upon category. Metals, no ways, you're not going to be able to see that. So I think we'll have to evaluate it through a category lens.
Based on category.
Yeah,
Very good.
It's important to note that labor costs in Mexico are now lower than they are in China. Chinese labor costs have gone up significantly, as much as 20, 30, 40% in some cases.
Yeah, that's correct. That's another macro trend that's playing out currently. Yeah, that's a very good observation, Professor. Next one is from Sitting Zhu. It's geopolitics. How would the supply chain in the pharma industry be affected in case of tension between China and Taiwan? And how can companies be prepared for this geopolitical risk?
Yeah, my personal observation is, there's been a lot of discussions about China invading Taiwan. I don't personally believe that's going to happen, and there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, the effects on the global economy would be devastating. Everything was shut down, and in particular, Taiwan is the single biggest manufacturer of semiconductors in the world. Taiwan Semiconductor has, I think, 40% market share. And so, China invaded, I don't think that Taiwan would be able to continue to produce at the level they are, and there would be massive shortages of chips. In the pharmaceutical sector, I don't know how much of pharmaceutical production occurs in Taiwan. I'm not familiar with that, but it would likely be the same thing where a lot of the Taiwanese citizens are very anti-China for good reasons, and I don't think they would willingly cooperate just to continue to produce, especially, China is heavily dependent on Taiwan, especially for chips. So they don't want to cut off, the golden goose that is giving them the golden eggs as well. So.
Okay. Next question is from Kiran Srinivas. Is there any preparedness from a planning perspective required for potential +1 countries to replace China?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Preparedness, is that what he said?
Yeah, preparedness. So how to plan for potential +1 countries to replace China? Sourcing strategy.
I think we've covered a lot of those elements. Doing a really in-depth supplier assessment, understanding alternative logistics channels, understanding tariffs and other costs that might come into place, understanding currency issues, understanding regulatory requirements to make sure that you're not violating any regulatory requirements coming from those countries. There's a lot of preparedness. It's not something, like I said, that we can snap our fingers and do quickly. There's a lot of work to make that happen. Val, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, just a quick point to add. So I don't know which industry Kiran represents, Shakti, but one of the things which I've seen a lot of clients do is to do a quick check on the US Treasury Department's specially designated nationals and block persons list. They call it the SDN list. It's very common. So the first level of preparedness which is done is, if I'm looking for a supplier outside of China, but for example, nearshored from China, the Philippines and the Thailands and the Vietnams of the world, they usually do a check if you're doing business from the US. So that could be a starting point just to make sure that any regulatory flags are taken care of. But like I said, it depends upon which industry Kiran represents. Just thought I'll add that in.
Thanks. So it's a comment from Rajinder Bandal. It's not a question, it's a comment. Reshored manufacturing requires fewer but more skilled workers and will not easily occur without major policy changes. However, the positive impact on job creation in the home country will be truly wonderful. I think that's a good comment. Thanks for your comment, Rajinder. I think we are kind of running out of time. Can we take one question, gentlemen?
Yeah. Okay. I want to make just one follow-up comment.
Sure.
I think this is a golden opportunity for India right now. India really has the potential to become the next global manufacturer, and I think that there's a lot of investment that's going in. I think India will also need to make a lot of changes around their governance and regulatory policies for that to happen as well. And I'm hopeful the government in India will take those measures to make it easier to manufacture and export from India. I know it's a big challenge, but I think it's also a huge opportunity at the moment.
Absolutely, you're bullseye, Professor. It's once in a generation opportunity for India and even other countries such as Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and only one hopes that they take advantage of it. So final question, Vail, I think it's to you because you had mentioned about chemicals moving away from China. So this is from Krista Sanders. Can you please touch on the chemical constraints concerning China? What are the constraints that chemical manufacturers currently experiencing in China?
Yeah, so I think the biggest one would be carbon emissions, Shakti. So I think that's the biggest constraint which is which I think is plaguing the chemical industry over there. So I think the government is super strict when it comes to carbon emissions, and I think a lot of suppliers tier 2, tier 3 are shutting shop because of that. But I think that's what it is. And I noticed that we've run out of time too. But I've got some really good reading material which we can send to Krista if we've got her email address. Can that be done, Shakti? We can send that post this meeting.
Yeah, 100%. Just one quick question from Anne Edgington. I think it's for you, Vail. Which Barrow platform was shown? I mean, you demoed it, right? Was it live.ai or AB conversational AI in the example? Which one is it?
So the conversation was AB, Shakti. And then what I showed as data sets was basically a mock-up which was built purely for today's meeting. So it's existing Barrow data shown in the form of a nearshoring tool, but we could continue discussing on that.
Okay, cool. I think that's it from us. We have truly run out of time, gentlemen. Thank you so much, Professor Hanfield and Vail. That was a wonderful exposition of the China Plus One sourcing strategy. We received several more interesting questions, but unfortunately we have run out of time. We will try to reply by email to the questions that were not answered in today's session. Some people had asked, will we be sharing the recording? Yes, we will send you a recording link soon. This marks the end of our session. A big thank you to all the participants for logging in today. And yeah, we'll be sharing the webinar recording with all of you soon. Please do reach out to the email address on the Q&A box if you have any additional questions. Thank you and have a good day. And to all those in Asia, good night.
Thank you very much. And I also have a blog if people are interested in reading more about my ideas. So
definitely. Definitely, we'll circulate that around. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking time out and talking to you. Thank you, Vail. Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, bye-bye.